When we started to learn CSS, everyone explained us that the basic style that we are seeing in the browsers, the style that you see even before you're writing one single line of CSS code, are coming from the user agent style sheet. This is kind of the god of CSS that creates us all the basic style in the browser. Or isn't it? If we are doing inspect element for a div element, we can really see that this div by default have the display property with a value of block, and we can really see that this is coming from the user agent style sheet. But when I'm doing the same thing for a span element, I'm not seeing here anything. Everyone knows that by default the span element have the display property with a value of inline. But the question here is why? Why I'm not seeing the display property with a value of inline in this specific case? And to understand why we are not seeing it, we need to talk about something else. We need to talk about the global CSS reset keywords. In CSS, we have 4 values that we can use on any property in CSS. I'm talking about the inherit value, about the initial value, the unset value, and the revert value. And let's start with the first one, the inherit value. Like his name, it can do for us inheritance in CSS. And let's see a small example of coding this thing. As you can see, I have here this div with a class of box. This div with a class of box has border, has background color, width, height, and some margin. But for all the inner element of div, what I'm doing here, I'm giving them the inherit value. You see width with inherit, height with inherit, and this way they are inheriting the style from the parent. Interesting. And let's continue to the second value, the initial value. Every property in CSS has initial value. You maybe already know it. Padding by default has the initial value of 0. Margin has the initial value of 0 as well. The position property has the initial value of static. This is also mean that if you will use the initial value on the padding property, it will be equal to 0. Initial on the margin property will be equal to 0 as well, and the initial value in the position property will be equal to static. Makes sense, nothing's really special. But what will happen if I will use the initial value on the display property on a div element? Maybe you are thinking that you know this specific answer, because div, by default, have the display property with a value of block. And maybe you are thinking that the initial value will be equal to block. Wrong answer. When you will use the initial value on the display property on the div element, it will be equal to inline. And you may be asking yourself why it's be equal to inline. And this is a really interesting question. The reason for that is that the initial value don't care about which element you are putting it on. You can put it on a div, span, table, or any HTML element. It will be always equal to inline. The reason for that the initial value for every one of the properties in CSS, we have only one initial value. It doesn't look even on which element you are putting it. It doesn't care which element you are putting it on. And how can you know what is the initial value of every one of the properties? Really easy. You just can search it in MDN. And under the category of the initial value, here you can see the display property. And under the category of the initial value, it's equal to inline. And remember, every property in CSS has only one initial value. Okay? And this is bring us back on how we are getting the basic styles in the browser. First, all the property in CSS has initial value. It doesn't care which element you are checking. All the property in CSS has only one initial value. But some of the style we want to change. Like the div specifically have the display property with a value of block. This is coming from the user agent style sheet that is changing some of those styles of some specific HTML element. And this is the reason why when we are doing inspect element for div, we are seeing this display property with a value of block. Think about it. The only reason that we are seeing it, that this is a special style for a specific HTML element. And the reason why we are not seeing anything on the span element, because we don't want to see the initial style. Think about it. If we want to see the initial style, If you will do inspect element, you will see all the properties that exist in CSS with their own initial style. And because of that, we're not seeing here anything, because we don't want to see those initial values. We just want to see what is special with a specific element. And because of that, this div is showing you the display property with a value of block. This is kind of overriding the default of display inline that we are getting by default for all the HTML elements. And if you want to see what is the special style that we have some specific HTML element, the best way is to look in one of the user agent style sheet of the browser. This is a really small part from the user agent style sheet that we have in Chrome. As you can see here, some specific HTML element by default have the property of display with a value of none. This is the reason why when you're writing the style element, you don't see it in the browser. When you are using the script element, again, you don't see it. The reason for that this is overriding and giving it display none. And for fun, you can try to give it display block, and you will see it in the browser. And of course, the body element, for example, by default have the display property with a value of block, and it has the margin of 8 pixels that we really hate, and every time we need to override it to 0. And if we are talking about overriding, we need to talk about CSS resets. Every time I'm seeing it, web developers are talking, what is better, to use CSS normalize or to use CSS reset? I want to tell you that no matter what, you need to use CSS normalize. CSS normalize is really important because beside of its fixing those problems between browsers, it's also taking care on some shadow DOM elements. CSS reset doesn't care about shadow DOM elements. And if you don't like some specific styles, of course you can override them with CSS reset. But the CSS reset is always need to come after the CSS normalize layer that you're putting in your own project. In other words, you can put CSS normalize and CSS reset combined. And this is an example why CSS normalize is really important. You see, these are shadow DOM elements that the normalized CSS is fixing that all the web browser will look the same. Again, here with the filed upload button, this is taking care about elements that looking different between different browsers. And if you don't like the basic style that are coming with your own browser, of course you can remove them. A lot of time when we are using header elements, we don't want to use the default font size, font weight, and margin, and we can just override them with a CSS reset. And CSS reset, I'm using CSS reset in every one of my projects, as well as the CSS normalize. But now let's continue to our third CSS reset keyword. Let's talk about the unset value. And the unset value is working in a really, really special way. The unset value sometimes behaving like inherit value if you are using it on properties that has inherit by default. And in other times, it's behaving like initial if you are putting it in properties that doesn't have inherited by default. And maybe now in your mind, what you just said for us, what does it exactly mean? Sometimes the unset value is behaving like inherit, and in other times it's behaving like initial. What does it mean? For that, we need to talk about another very special thing. In CSS, we have two types of group of properties. The first group of properties is the inherit properties, and the second group of properties is the uninherit properties. Let's start with the first group, inherit properties. In this group of properties, we have all the typography properties. Think about it. When you are using color of text, font size, font weight, line height, text shadow, if you are putting it on a container, it will automatically affect all the inner elements. But why it's affecting all the inner elements? Because those properties by default have a special behavior of inheritance. And how can you know if a specific element by default have inheritance? It's mainly the typography properties. But if you want to be sure, again, you can check on the MDN website. This is the example of the font size page, okay? And as you can see under the category of inherited, it has a value of yes, because the font size, by default, have inheritance. In the second group of properties, we have all the properties that doesn't have inherited. This is the uninherited properties. In this group, we have all the other properties that you can think of, all the box model properties like padding, margin, borders, CSS position, displays like flexbox grid, transform animation, and many more. And how can you know if this property is uninherited properties? Again, under the MDN, for example, this is the page of CSS position. You can see under the category of inherited that it has the value of no. This way you know that this property doesn't have inherited. And this is bring us back to the unset value, how it behaved. If I'm putting the unset value on color of text, because it has by default inherited, it will behave exactly like the inherit keyword. And if I'm putting the unset value on a property that doesn't have inherited by default, like the padding property, it will behave like initial. And now you may be asking yourself, why not just to use instead, if it's working sometime like this and in the other time like this, why not to use instead just the initial value or the inherit value? And there are two reasons why to use the unset value. If you are thinking about it, when you want to reset a typography property, you will always want to reset it to inherit. The unset will do it for you automatically. And if I'm resetting a property that doesn't have inherited, like padding, I will always want to reset it to initial, or most of the time I will want to reset it to initial. And if you are using the unset value, it will do it for you automatically. But still, why not just to use the initial or the inherit value? And there is another a lot better reason why to use the unset value. This is because we have another really special property in CSS that so many web developers don't even know that it exists. This is the most special property that exists in CSS. I'm talking about the all property. The all property is like to take all the property that exists in CSS and combine them to one property. In this way, I can reset all the properties combined, and I can use now the unset value. And all the typography property will be reset to inherited, and all the other property will be reset to initial. In this way, I don't need to go one by one and to reset all of them. I can now just reset all of them with the property of all and the unset value. Think about it. You have a container, and inside the specific container, you want to reset all the elements. Just do it with one property. It's so easy to use. This is a really huge power how to reset a specific container inside your own project. But now you need to ask yourself another question. When we want to reset the div element, the display property specifically, if I will use the initial value, it will be equal to inline. If I will use the unset value, it will be equal to initial, that will be equal to inline. But when we are resetting the display property on a div element, in most of the case, I want to reset it to the default style that I'm getting from the user agent style sheet. What, I cannot reset the div element to the default value of the browser, of the value of block? Of course you can. And for that, we have our last fourth value. I'm talking about the revert value. And the revert value is working in a really special way. If I'm using the revert value in the display property and the div element, in this case, it will first search the default style that I have in the user agent style sheet. And if this property is existing on the user agent style sheet on this specific element, it will use this specific value of block. But now you need to ask yourself another question. What is happening if I'm using this revert value on a property that doesn't exist on the user agent style sheet? And if you are doing so, it will behave like the unset value. This means that if I'm putting the revert value on the font size property, because it doesn't have any style on the div element, it will behave like unset, that behave like inherit, and it will be equal to inherit. And if I will use the revert value on the padding property that doesn't exist in the user agent style sheet, it will behave like unset, and in the case of uninherit property, it will be equal to initial. Nice. And maybe you're asking yourself why we need those features. They are amazing features, but why we need to know those specific features? The first reason, if you want to play with your friends in your company and you want to do some joke, you can put in the CSS reset star, all inherit, and this way if some web developer putting border to one element, all the inner element getting borders, and nothing is working, and you can have some fun and play with your friends. But this is just for a joke, and now let's talk about a lot better reason that you can think of. Web designer, they love to design checkboxes. They don't like this ugly checkbox. They love this beautiful checkbox. And web developers already find a solution. What they're doing, they take the checkbox, they wrap it with a label element, adding after the checkbox another sibling element, and if it's this checks, go to the sibling element and please do this style, and yikes of code. You don't want to work in this way. And now you can't, because now I can give the checkbox the all property with a value of unset. This is deleting all the default style of this specific checkbox. And when I'm putting this thing on, you cannot see the checkbox. It has a size of 0 and 0 pixel, background color transparent. You cannot see it and you cannot click on it. And even if you could click on it, you don't know if it's checked or unchecked because I deleted all the style of this specific checkbox. But now I can create my own style. And let's see how I'm really working with it. In this CodePen example, as you can see in the part of the HTML, I have only one element, a checkbox element, nothing special. And what I'm doing here, I'm designing this checkbox. This is a real checkbox. Yes, yes, this is a native checkbox, my friends. Okay, this is a native. And how I'm designing it? I'm first deleting all the style, all unset. Then I'm starting to create my own styles. But wait a minute, how I'm creating the button inside? Interesting question. I'm using the before pseudo element. But wait a minute, how am I moving it when it's checked? Really easy, I'm just using the check pseudo class on the before pseudo element, and I'm just moving it when it's checked. And in this way, you can design, of course, the over, focus, disable in every way that you want. And for you to believe me that this is a really native checkbox, the only thing that I need to do is just to delete the style, and let me delete the style, and you will see that this is a, let's see it, a native checkbox. And if I will bring back the style, you will see the animation that bring it on. Nice. Okay. The second reason that I thought about what we can do with all this feature, if you are thinking about all this feature, these are a CSS reset feature. And in 2007, we got the CSS reset of Eric Meyer, if I'm not mistaken, that delete most of the style of specific element. But what I don't like with this CSS reset, that we have this long CSS selector. This is really hard to understand when you are debugging your code in Chrome. You always see this big chunk of code, and it's making a lot of noise when you're trying to understand what doesn't work with your own CSS part. And I thought about it that with this new feature, we can create a new CSS reset. And my main idea that this will be the new CSS reset, just deleting all the style and bringing back the display property again. But this is maybe a good idea in the thinking, but it didn't work for me as I wanted. But this brings me the idea that maybe we can create with this feature a new CSS reset. Then I started to create my own new CSS reset. I called it the new CSS reset. And it has the part that deleting most of the style of most of the elements and creating other fixes that are really important that we will have in CSS reset. And then I published this project on GitHub. And people really loved it, but they found some bugs. And what is good when you are publishing a project on GitHub, that people help you to solve those bugs. And they helped me to solve those minor bugs. And in the end, I have this new project that helps you to create the most reset project that you can create. This is the project on GitHub, the new CSS reset. This is an NPM. It has now more than 3,500 downloads per week. And if you want to try it, you can find it, of course, on GitHub. If you want to know more about it, you can read my interview on CSS Tricks or my full article in Medium, these links. And before we finish, my friend, again, I'm Elad Shechter. And if you want to see more of the CSS stuff that I'm doing, follow me via my Twitter. And thank you.
Okay, question for the second awesome part. Alexander? Yeah, perfect. Yours.
Okay, I have a question. Hello. Then, if I use your package, do I need the normalized CSS?
What I'm doing, because when I'm using this CSS reset, and it's really important, this is kind of deleting, when I'm using here this where pseudo class, it's deleting all the CSS specificity. And because of that, I'm using only the shadow DOM part, that the problem that I have that if you're using the normalize first and then the CSS reset, HTML element has a CSS specificity of one element. This selector doesn't have a CSS specificity, and because of that, even if the normalize come first, it can override me the style of CSS reset, and it's not good. How can you solve it? In two ways. One, to use only this most important part that are all the shadow DOMs. It's all the all those points, like, let me show you. Let me bring it back here on the CSS reset. No, this one. Only to keep up with these special parts. These are the most special parts that I want to get from the CSS normalize. And the second thing, if you're afraid to change stuff, you can just wrap all those selector with the web pseudo class. .where and just wrap all the selector. In this way, you are removing the CSS specificity, and it doesn't interfere with the CSS reset. You're putting first the normalize, then the CSS reset, and in this way, this will always win the normalize. And a better solution in the really near future, we will get the CSS layers, and this way, every layer is more stronger with the previous one, and I don't need to do this where, it's not hack, but this where selector. We can do it in the near future to wrap the normalize with one CSS layer, and the second one with another CSS layer, and in this way, it doesn't matter if this has a stronger CSS specificity, because this one always wins the previous layer. CSS layers is a really interesting feature that is already starting to come to web browser, and it's worth to take a look on it.
Okay, another question. Yeah. We can do this to our already running project?
This is a good question. I will tell you the truth. If you have already CSS reset, CSS normalized in the current project, when I'm working on a new project, I'm not, on older project, I don't try to change the CSS reset. Because it's already working, it can maybe create some other bugs. I prefer to use new CSS reset in a new project. And if it was me, I won't change the old CSS reset. Just in a new project, maybe start to use it.
The same with the normalized CSS?
Yes, yes. Even one time it happened to me that the normalize was getting a new version. And automatically I thought, I will just delete the old version and I will replace it with a new one. And it created me some minor bugs and you don't know where to find them. And in the end, I was just bringing back the older version in this case.
Okay, so if we don't have a normalized CSS, we don't add it? No.
I cannot see how I'm working without normalized CSS reset today, but in an old project, I will not add it after. Yeah, it's too dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Another question?
You can ask for both talks, you know, if you forgot about.
Anyone?
I'm not biting. Yet.
Okay, thank you so much.